Shalom. We're going to be in the letter to Titus today. As I indicated, we're not going verse by verse in the pastoral epistles. We're looking at studies in the pastoral epistles. So I've left 1 Timothy. I'm going to Titus, and then we'll get into 2 Timothy. I know I'm out of the biblical order, but I'm looking at the chronological order. Basically, we got 1 Timothy, Titus, and then, of course, 2 Timothy is Paul's last letter, and I will deal with it a little later. So there's lots of parallels between Titus and 1 Timothy. I think you'll see when we get to 2 Timothy, it's a very personal letter. It's Paul's last letter, and you can tell it's more I guess you would say emotionally driven. There's a certain urgency and emotion about it because Paul is penning his, whether he knew it or not, his last letter. He knew that his execution was forthcoming. He didn't know when, but he was encouraging Timothy to come if all possible to see him. And we don't know whether Timothy actually made it or not. But it's a different kind of letter than we find in 1 Timothy and Titus. 1 Timothy and Titus are sort of like, as I characterized it, business-like. There's instructions, mandates. 1 Timothy dealt with God's household rules. I stressed a lot in regard to leadership because I think that's a current issue that we're having to address, and it's not a new issue. It was dealt with the Apostle Paul in the first century. Now, we understand from 1 Timothy that Ephesus, you remember, was an established congregation, and I think in regard to 1 Timothy 2 and 3, where Paul deals extensively with the responsibilities of male and females, that there's an undercurrent in the Ephesus church that's a movement, or maybe there's some in the congregation that are pushing things, just like would happen today in a congregation where you might have individuals that would be pushing the envelope on certain teachings or movements or fads. Why are we to think that it didn't happen back then? I mean, it happens today all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons why Timothy is so, if you please, dogmatic about the role of men and women, because there's the danger of that evidently present in the church in Ephesus that might accommodate certain, movements, false teaching. And so you have Paul coming down hard in 1 Timothy chapter 3 when he talks about the qualifications for men regarding spiritual leadership. Now, I indicated I don't think that he's talking about in 1 Timothy 3 the wives of the deacons or the elders. I think he's relating or re-emphasizing what he already dealt with in chapter 2. And I think there's a cultural situation that's present in 1 Timothy. It seems to me, if there are currents of people violating the household rules or the temptation to do so because of the environment and the culture, Paul is being real strong in 1 Timothy 3. I'm very conservative on 1 Timothy 3. I don't think it allows for deaconesses. And I think when Paul talks about women must be, that he's reiterating, and he's actually taken women out of this process of leadership qualifications for men. He's reminding the ladies what he already told them in chapter 2. And it to me, it's even more emphatic in chapter 3 because there's an emphasis on male spiritual leadership, and the women are not involved. And Paul is being very forceful about that. And I think it makes sense in light of the culture where there's female leadership everywhere, religion, everything. And the church is counter to the culture in Ephesus. So, like I said, whether you take it as the wives of deacons or the wives of deacons and elders, I don't think it diminishes the text. But I think you missed the punch, the real mandate that Paul is emphasizing in 1 Timothy 3, because it's all about male spiritual leadership. And then you have a little blurb in there about women, and I think he's bringing what he's already told women to remind them they have no part in this. And he goes forward with, let deacons be the husband of one wife. In other words, I think he is discouraging this movement of female leadership in the church, which again would prohibit, if I could use that word, the idea of deaconesses, where you have qualifications for deaconesses, for women to be deacons. The reason I say that, because a deacon, although a servant, is a leadership role. Because in order to be a deacon, you must first be a good manager of your home. Okay? And then when you've been tested, you can be considered or appointed as a deacon. And I think in Acts chapter 6, which I'll talk about this morning in regard to the appointment of deacons, that we had the first sort of preliminary program of how to appoint deacons when the 7 were appointed over the distribution of food. And once they were selected, they were put in charge of that ministry. So it's not just a service, which, a deacon is a servant, but he's placed in charge. There's delegation authority given to him in regard to the work that he's responsible for. It is a leadership position. So that's why I sort of take the view that I do. So I just wanted you to realize that. Now, in Titus 1, we're going to see Paul encouraging Titus to appoint elders, because it is a new congregation and it needs spiritual leadership. Titus may not be there for very long. He's going to ultimately be replaced by a man named Artemis. But he's given the responsibility to complete what is lacking. So that also tells me to complete what is lacking, to me, would imply that the Lord's church is not what it needs to be until it has leaders. That, in other words, I don't think it's good for a congregation to exist without elders for an indefinite period of time. That there needs to be a strong desire to appoint qualified men, of course, to be spiritual leaders. Otherwise, you'll have chaos, men's business meetings. And it just paves the way for other problems to come into play when there's not strong leadership. So we're dealing with a different situation in Titus. One's in Ephesus is an established church, and Paul's reiterating the roles of men and women. And then in Titus, it's a new congregation, one that needs to be matured and grown. So those are the kind of two issues. Now, the culture is a little bit different in Titus. We're on the Isle of Crete, okay? When you're on an island, you're off the mainland. It's kind of hard to enforce things if you're on an island, if you're subject to the government on the mainland. I mean, you're separated, okay? And it seems like things go on an island that that might not be apparent or going on the mainland. If you're a part of, the government, connection and all that, because you're secluded. And so you can get away with things, and things turn out to be a little bit different culture in the seclusion on an island. So I'll find this kind of interesting when we look at Titus, because it seems to be a whole different culture than the one in Ephesus. Now, there's similarities. The religions and various cults kind of encourage promiscuous behavior. But on the island of Crete, it seems to be really an accepted norm. In fact, they have a somewhat label that's been given to them. Okay, I've always have fancied myself of writing a book on sarcasm in the Bible. I think that would be a great study, because in our culture, that's sort of suppressed now. We'll talk about tonight the tolerance, new tolerance, all this stuff. But in the Bible, man, if it was this, it was that, and they had no hesitation of calling it out what it was. And it's fascinating in regard to what you read in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the names that are given to certain behaviors, or what's said about people who engage in this. It's kind of fascinating, but anyway, maybe it'll happen and maybe it won't. So the situation in Crete demands immediate action, and one of the reasons is there's a sect on the island of Crete that can be identified as with the uncircumcision, or the circumcision party, I'm sorry. There's some kind of pressure being placed on the congregation that seems to be a draw. And you know that wherever Paul went and the gospel went, there were always Jews that seemed to follow and stir up trouble. Whether they were of a strong orthodoxy, or even if it were Gentiles, there were always people who were in opposition to what was being taught. It's, as the book of Acts would describe, who would make crooked the way of God. There was always individuals who were rising up or just followed the evangelists wherever they went, and countered what they were teaching for whatever reason. We find that constantly in the book of Acts and in the New Testament itself. So the situation must have been pretty challenging, because Paul relates to Titus, and evidently it became known to Paul that whole families were being upset by the false teaching and whatever was happening. Whole families being upset, whole families being divided. It's kind of like, there's been several congregations that we've been a part of, and after we left over the years, we heard that they split, or there was something that happened, and you're thinking, why? Because when I was there, we were working, and you never would expect that to happen, but it does. Don's pointing the finger. He's saying it's your fault. No. Be careful what you do in your pew, because I might bring you out in the pulpit. You know what I'm saying? So you have, when entire families are being upset, led astray, or there's division within those families, it's going to create a lot of problems and difficulties and challenges that the church is going to have to contend with. Now, some of the differences, or at least one particular difference between our culture and the culture back then, is you had extended families. Families were large. Okay, it wasn't like the nuclear family that we have in the United States usually, with our, the parents and then 1.5 kids. Statistically, um, the the families, they were extended. From the Old Testament, you're familiar with the extended families that included a lot of people, and a lot of that existed in antiquity, particularly in the first century. So I take it when it talks about these families, I've got to think in regard to first century. What was a family? The limitations of the family. Was it just husband and wife and the children? No, I think it included a lot more. So you can see that there could be some real major disruption when families either turned on each other or became, upset. There was an upheaval. That's the idea that's being portrayed, and whole families being upset. So we have that problem that's existing in the culture and in the church. And I think a lot of it stems back to spiritual leadership. Who are the leaders of these families? What's going on? What's being promoted? We don't know for sure, but you can make some educated conjectures based upon what the text says. Because I'm under the persuasion that when the text is addressing something, it's not just addressing it for the sake of informing and giving knowledge and information. The epistles are usually written as a corrective measure, either as reestablishing something, correcting what's being practiced. So you can sort of assume when you read a New Testament letter that there are things that are happening in the congregation. It's the reason why Paul's addressing these particular things, not just for knowledge's sake, but as a corrective, as a mandate, as instruction to further the maturity of a congregation. So, the famous reputation of the Cretans, you know what it is, don't you? You might be offended by this, I don't know. Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. This can be traced back all the way back to 600 BC, by the way, from literature. Well, that's quite a reputation. I want to go to Crete, man. It'll be a lazy glutton. It's hedonist. That's what it is, being a hedonist. What's a hedonist? Someone described as a hedonist. What is that? Yeah. Engaged in immorality, just, it's all about pleasure and the flesh and that kind of thing. And when Paul referenced that, he's applying the label as, yes, that is a true reputation. I think he's acknowledging that. Is he stereotyping? Well, a stereotype usually comes when there is an overwhelming practice within a group that causes the stereotype. So it's not like the stereotype is not without any, germ of truth to it. Usually there's a stereotype because of certain practices or behaviors and things of that nature. Everyone is a stereotype, depending on what culture. If you're an African American, there's a stereotype and various things. If you're a white person, they'll talk about the stereotypes of the white person. Look at comedy. Comedy is built on accentuating the stereotypes. And the funniest comedy, I think, is when they get it right. When they say what everybody knows, but everybody's afraid to say about each, culture. Because there are stereotypes. And here Paul is, reminding the congregation that, you live within a culture that has the stereotype. And he doesn't deny it, but it presents opportunity as well as challenges. So to what extent, I would have to say that if they have developed that reputation, Paul doesn't refute it, then it must be pretty prevalent, even though not all Cretans are that way. it's an overstatement, of course, but there must be some truth to it in order for it to develop. I don't think it was just someone just making it up. Well, you know those people. They're da-da-da-da-da-da. No, it's a stereotype comes as a result of some grain of truth. So this is somewhat different from what I think the church in Ephesus is facing as a dominant threat to the congregation. The Ephesus church was threatened by certain cultural, emphases, particularly female leadership with all the cults and the various religions that are around, and it's impacting, I think, certain views in the church. It's like what happens, have culture out here doing something, pretty soon we'll be talking about it. The church will be restudying something because there's the temptation of following the culture instead of being counter to it. It's harder to remain sound than it is to start changing gradually. If you change gradually, you don't see it until later. All of a sudden, we have a female elder. And you go, well, how did we get there? Well, it started all the way back here in restudying and the culture. So we'll be seeing more and more of that's happening. And it's not, as I've said, it's not saying anything about the abilities of men and women and their capabilities. It has to do with being in alignment with God's will, which I know that's what we want to be. No matter how difficult it is to be that in a culture that counters that. Yes? Yes. Yeah. It's like, in other words, what was said is it's much easier to go in the direction of culture than it is to realize that you've gone too far and you need to go back. You don't ever see that very much. Think about the universities that were once Christian universities, Harvard, Yale. They were denominational religious schools, but they're as secular as you can imagine now. Well, see how it's hard. No, I don't know of any school that started out as a religious Christian school that got too far and decided, hey, we need to go back. The closest one maybe has been Moody Institute, that they had a change in president, and he said, we're not going that way. He was a little bit more conservative. But I've never really seen that on a big scale. That's why we've always, that's the challenge of the Bible college, like at Faulkner and things, is we may be viewed as being like reactive to everything. But I think we get the reputation because sometimes we have to challenge what's being done. Or this or that. And so the Bible college, the Bible department in every Christian university is always, if it goes off, then the door's open to anything because you can justify anything through theology if you want to. But it's always been, I think, the challenge of a Bible college to be sound to its biblical roots. Who's responsible for that? Well, administration, yeah, but isn't it the Bible college? That's those, we're the ones that teach the Bible and things of that nature. So it can be, it's even difficult, and I can see in other Christian colleges to where, those guys are always going to be against anything we do. And I remember telling the board once, and I'm not coming down on Faulkner or anything. I'm just telling you there's situations that occur. They would occur in any place. That I remember talking with the board once, how sometimes we're like a voice crying in the wilderness, and on different things, and how some have viewed us, and it's only because The reason we are like naysayers or have the reputation is, well, if you'd quit doing what you're doing, we wouldn't be naysayers. You know what I'm saying? It's like the prophets. They were naysayers, and they had the reputation. Well, why run it towards Jeremiah? He's going to say no anyway. So why do we need his opinion? You know where he stands. That's right. You know where Jeremiah stands. So it's that kind of thing that schools and churches always face. Yes. Yeah. 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 Leadership has the challenge of seeing what's now to what it leads to. And that's what the leaders are looking at, what it leads to. It might look good, fine, but once you start a trajectory, you don't see it at first, you see it in its end result. So um, that, I think, is the challenge of having discernment, that if we can critically think about things and discuss things and see where it leads to. Now, if it leads to something that's good, yeah, let's do it, man. But we always have to consider that, because it only takes just a little bit of angle to later on you have the big wide divide. Think of church history when things began, and then the divide we have in all the religious organizations and stuff. So that's sort of the kind of thing that Paul's addressing. And so, in contrast to Timothy, Timothy's work is among established church, as I indicated, and Paul is helping Titus to help the church to grow and to become complete in a climate that is not, conducive, a climate that is not really spawning faithfulness, and discipline and all those things that would be Christian in virtue. Timothy's task was to maintain a healthy eldership, and Titus is to appoint elders for a young church. Titus was a Gentile, by the way. He became Paul's test case for circumcision, if you might recall, securing for Gentiles a gospel separate from Jewish requirements of the law. The book of Galatians deals with the divide that was over allowing Gentiles into the church. The Gentiles being uncircumcised, and the Jews believing that circumcision was the orthodoxy, was that which puts you in a relationship with God. And under the Old Covenant, it was the sign of the covenant. But even God taught, and the prophets said, that physical circumcision was not a guarantee of acceptance, that it's the circumcision of the heart, as the New Testament brings out, that is what God has been looking for. So, Titus being a little bit different, Paul had his son in the gospel, which is Timothy, and now he also has Titus, whom he calls as his son. And I think that has to do with Paul being, in a close relationship. He's the father of the gospel of these individuals and training them, but he's not using it in an ecclesiastical sense. Okay, it's very personal for Paul. Titus was one of Paul's converts and a co-worker with Paul from the early years of his ministry. You can see in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and 7 and 8 where we have Titus being referred to and all that. Titus was going to be replaced by Artemas, and Titus was eventually going to join Paul in another location. Now, what I wanted to focus on in us reading a little bit is the countering to the culture. The way to impact culture is to live counter to it. That always brings out the attention. If you're with culture, you're with it. You're like it. There's nothing to call attention to. And that's, I don't know. To me, it seems we would do greater in our evangelism instead of adapting to culture if we would just maintain a counterculture thrust. It would. I think there's a lot of people who are starving for truth and for conviction. And in a culture like we have, there's really no conviction per se. Conviction is only there as long as it suits me. And if things change, then my convictions change. That's not biblical. That's not the way we've been taught by God. That's never the answer. The answer has been to be Christian in whatever culture you're in. And most of the time, Christianity is going to be counter to it. Now, there was a time, it's becoming more oddballish to be a Christian, it seems, in our culture today. I don't know, do you think? It's becoming a little bit odd. Or at least we're made to think that way because of the deluge of ridicule or, I don't know, things that are said about Christians. Maybe Christians have exposed themselves to that ridicule in some ways of not being very deep in their convictions. But whatever the case, the answer to me is not what I used to believe was the church growth movement that came out of Fuller University, a decade or two ago, that talked about marketing the church. And the marketing the church concept sounded good because, we need to strategize and get people in the building. And there are ways of doing that. Entertainment, free food, all kinds of things that churches have tried. And all for the noble goal of growing. But what happened is we got people to churches, but no one with conviction. So you start having church hopping. It's whoever has the best buffet, either for children or for whatever. And so we pick and choose, and we have maybe inadvertently, I'm talking about we generally, have conditioned a class of Christians or people to think of church as accommodating me. And that's troublesome. That's troubling. Yes.
One thing we think in our country that we have it tough.
Yeah.
We have persecution. Get this, the last few days, a person who worked with house church networks in Afghanistan reports its leaders received letters from the Taliban warning them that they know where they are and what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the leaders of these house churches say they're not going.
Yeah.
We're not facing near.
Yeah. Dave was indicating certain Christians in Afghanistan now being threatened by the Taliban. And we have Dr. Sabir at Faulkner, who's a brilliant individual who works with the church in Pakistan. And, he's always very careful when he meets over the internet or whatever, because of what the Pakistani leaders might do to the house churches and, various leaders in Christianity and stuff. So, yeah, you're right. We know nothing of that. Of course, that's not to say it never will happen, because, as I said, the trajectory, if we just have a little bit, we don't know where it's going to end up eventually. But the church will always survive. And the way it survives is through its conviction. In death or in life, who cares? Jesus is Lord. And I'm going to follow him, whether you mandate me to do otherwise. I'll be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, If the Lord wills, he can deliver us. And if he doesn't, praise be the Lord. That's some kind of conviction. Yes. Well, he's training us to think that those things are really affirmation that we're doing something right. I think. So it's hard to reframe things because, like you, I want to be liked. I want everybody to get along, and I want to live my peaceful life, and everything to go forward. But being a Christian does not guarantee that, and it can actually bring upon itself certain ire from culture that otherwise I wouldn't have to deal with if I wasn't a Christian. You see? But so be it. There's greater things than my comfort, and that's easy to say, but it's really challenging if the comfort is threatened. So that's the situation. The way to impact culture is to live counter to it. Don't accept the norms of society. It's been surprising in reading the book of Acts and other things that sometimes doors were opened when Christians stood with their convictions. Some people admire that. And in fact, because of that admiration during times of persecution, some high officials began to look favorably upon Christians because of their integrity and their conviction, their loyalty to both, government. They wanted to be good citizens. They were good citizens. They tried to be, and their loyalty to Christ. In fact, one of the, I like to look at background and structure in the text. And in the book of Acts, every effort is made to show that the church is not responsible for what others are claiming about it. Because in the book of Acts, you find that Gentiles and others find favor with Christianity. They're impressed when they meet them, and they realize, this isn't true. And there's this this view and this movement in Acts to where Christianity is innocent of the charges that have been made against it, against the empire and things of that nature. It's what others are saying. But when people learn that, as David was talking about Wednesday, the love feast, the fellowships, and they had a different way about them, a different thing. And the uninitiated misunderstood it. And when they understood it, through the writings of early, writers and others who wrote to emperors and leaders about Christian faith, they began to, okay. But some just, outright hated Christianity. So for Christian living on the island of Crete, the means to be counter to culture is to engage in, guess what? Good works. Good activity. So look at Titus 1 and verse 8. When something's repeated over and over and over again, you have to assume that this must be a major theme in the book. So we have, be hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort, and this is about elders, okay, both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. Here you got qualifications, and all of these things have to do with being good and engaged in good behavior and activity in a culture that's not conducive to that. That encourages the opposite. So we have it from the leaders. Verse 16. They profess to know God. These are individuals who are, lazy gluttons, evil beasts, and things of that nature. Those who are accepting the lifestyle of the culture around them. And what hedonism lacks, as you can imagine, is what? Good works. Hedonists are not engaged in good works. They're engaged in that which is good for their pleasures, not good works. Okay? And so we have stress that they profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. So imbibing in the culture on Crete and thinking it has benefit for you is actually a hindrance to good works and just overall goodness as a person and particularly as a Christian. Look at chapter 2, verse 7. We'll start in verse 6. Likewise urge the young men to be sensible. In all things show yourself to be example of what? How do you get Cretans off the cot? How do you get noticed in Crete? When everything is about pleasure, leisure, what have you. You got to show an example of good works. Now, imagine families who have teenagers being influenced by Crete. I don't know if teenagers were any different back in the first century. They're probably more respectful because of the environment of the extended family and everything. But you can imagine the draw, if it's not checked, that could be attractive to young men, young people. And so, Titus is encouraging the behavior of individuals, older men, young men, to be careful that they need to be an example of good works. Well, what is a good work in the midst of hedonism? He doesn't. This is the thing about Christianity. People want to know, well, what? What should I do? Okay? God leaves it up to you a lot to understand what good works is, to figure it out, to practically apply. It's not God's part. It's not even the preacher's part always to give you an example or do you figure out in your own life. Because there's the principle, and we have to wrestle with that. What is it? What does God call me to do? Of course, we're not left without examples and teaching and things of that nature. But what is a good work? How would you define a good work? What do you think a good work is? Okay. Go ahead. Someone say something? Yeah. Which a hedonist wouldn't do necessarily. Yeah. I think any exact opposite. Go ahead. What? Yeah. I don't think that we have a problem with identifying what a good work would be. There's just something innately, in our understanding of Christianity, our love for Christ, that it's not difficult to know. Sometimes your conscience will tell you that you need to do this as a good thing. Or not doing it, is not good. You need to. So we have mechanisms and understanding of what a good work is. But he's constantly saying, be examples. Be examples of good work. Be examples. There's people who profess. What does that tell you? They profess, but they deny. See, anybody can profess Jesus. Anybody can say his name. Anybody can wear an emblem. Anybody can have a tattoo of the cross. Anybody can have, but what is it that really makes a Christian? It's the conviction that makes it. Look at verse 14. Who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous of good works. What is the word zeal, being zealous? How do you understand that? If you have zeal for something, describe your behavior. Aggressive. It's all you can think about. You know, it's that kind of thing. Are we creative? Are we zealous? Do we wake up in the morning excited to be an example of God's glory on earth, engaging in good works? You want to get attention? That'll get attention. People won't understand you because we are a selfish society. You think about it. Okay, we'll finish it up next week. Any questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Time's up. Hey, what do you want me to do? I can't roll back time.